I'm currently working on building this custom subwoofer enclosure for two JL Audio 13W3s. In this video, tons of tips and tricks for building a complex slot-ported enclosure that also incorporates an angled face and for getting precise results. Hey, what's up everyone? If you're new here, I'm Mark. Welcome to CarAudioFabrication. Here on this channel, we learn how to design, build, and install our dream car audio system. Let's get on into it. In the previous video, this is the design style that we came up with here. We are going with the two subwoofers firing upwards with the port to the rear, and to make things a little bit more complicated, we have an angle on the rear side of the enclosure. This results in some internal port walls that also must be angled. Before we start a custom enclosure build, it's always a good idea to, of course, have a plan. So if you guys need help with a subwoofer box blueprint design, I'd love to help you out. You guys can see all the different options that I have on my website, CarAudioFabrication.com. Now in this video, I want to focus a little bit more on some of the detail work that we need to do to these different pieces. So I'm going to kind of breeze through the initial panel cutting here, but I do want to give you guys a couple of tips along the way. One of which would be when you're cutting your panels, I recommend that you remove the factory edges of the material. That's because these factory edges here have a tendency to get beat up in shipment. So if we can expose a new fresh edge, we're going to have a lot better finished results. As an example, this front piece of the enclosure that I need to cut, it has a 38-inch width dimension. So what I'll do is I'll actually cut my board to about 38.5 inches. I will then flip it over and cut to that final dimension, thus making sure that each of my edges is new. The other thing that's important to do for an enclosure like this, where we have many different angles, is we want to make sure that we do the proper table saw techniques to get those angles perfect. So I do have a full dedicated video all about that you can watch after this one. Now when it comes to cutting some of the other pieces where you have your blade at a 90 because all the sides are square, but it has an angle on it, I sometimes like to do the technique that I showed in that previous video where I use the known offset of the fence along with measuring out where I want the cut to be and then using double-sided template tape to stick that piece to the piece of known width so that I can cut it on the table saw. But the other option is we can take our dimensions that are shown in our blueprint, we can measure them out on the board and draw a line and then use a template on the router. Ignore this side here, this is just scrap material, but imagine that we measured out the dimension from there to there, along with here to here, and then we used double-sided template tape and stuck our template in position. We could then use the flush trim bit on the router to make that cut. But in my case here, this is one of the port walls and I want it to be exactly the same on each side. So instead I'm going to use this one that I've already made and template tape it to this one below to make a copy. The other spot that this comes in handy is creating this second port wall, and this is actually a really complicated piece. First of all, you can see it has an angled cut on this profile here along with the bottom, and that's to go along the back side of the enclosure and match the back angle of the back wall. But at the same time, because there's a port distance from that top point to the front of the enclosure and the bottom point to the front of the enclosure, we need to have an angle in this direction as well. If this is confusing, go back and watch the previous video where I did the design of this enclosure to fully understand. The blueprint here makes it more easy. I had the angled cuts on each side, and then I needed to cut each of these dimensions here, which I measured from here to here and here to here. I drew a line and then used, again, this straight template to make that angled cut. And again, because this is going to be a mirror copy of the other one, a little something like this right here, I'm going to stick it in place onto this one that I need to cut and make that copy. So from using our blueprint design, we now have all of our raw pieces of wood cut. Before we get into the assembly process, I want to show you guys this and say a quick thank you to our show sponsor, KnuKonceptz. So KnuKonceptz sells a wide variety of different car audio wire and distribution parts. But they also make this unique part right here. This is the Ultimate Battery Terminal. This battery terminal gives us multiple different ways to attach aftermarket wiring for things like an amplifier install. But even cooler yet, if we take off one of these side screws right here, we can add an optional post adapter. The advantage of this is now you don't need to cut your factory connection that goes to the rest of the electrical in the vehicle. You can connect it right there as is. If we take this off here, there's also an option for this style of post that just threads in the side, depending on the layout configuration that you're looking for. This thing is so unique. I have a full video on the channel all about its features, so you guys can learn more and go directly to KnuKonceptz via the links down in the video description. Now, let's get back into doing the detail work on these pieces. First, I want to focus on some of the detail work for everything that's associated with the port. The reason I want to do that first is I want to use some flat black paint here in order to coat the inside pieces of the enclosure, and this is much easier to do prior to assembly, and I also want to allow time for that paint to dry, so we're going to do that first. This is the port divider piece, and this sits in the middle here between the two ports, and I want to add a rounded edge to this side here. As noted, we can do this via sanding, or in my case, I'm going to use a router. I'm going to go with a 1/4-inch round over bit, so you guys can see the profile that that's going to add to the edge. And once loaded into the router, this is simple enough. Just make that cutting pass on each side. That gives me this rounded edge profile on this part. While I have that bit loaded, I also want to address these inside corners of the port along with the port ends. I'm going to bust those out real quick as well. There we have it, all of our roundovers added on these various port pieces. For the port on the front of this enclosure here, I need to have an opening, and those are going to be exposed edges that I also want to paint, so I'm going to do that detail work now as well. I'll once again check my blueprint here to get all the different measurements that I need for this cutout. Now, if you look closely, you'll notice that I have a line here that I had to erase. Everyone makes mistakes, and that's why you always want to measure twice and cut once. I did actually make an incorrect measurement. I went 16 5/8 from the side, which I'm supposed to, and then I mirrored that dimension over here, but what I actually did was measured 15 5/8 on accident, and I found this mistake when I measured the port width, which is supposed to be 4 3/4 in the front here. It actually measured 5 3/4, and I'm like, hey, something's off. Luckily, I caught it. Again, always measure twice, cut once. I've put an X on the inside here. We need to rough cut this out using a jigsaw, and then we're going to use template tape along with several different straight router templates. You could also use straight boards if needed. Once I have those in place, we're using a flush trim bit on the router to perfectly cut this rectangle. After I fully cut out the port opening on the front of the enclosure there, I again wanted to add a round-overed edge in order to have that smooth airflow going in and out of the port, so I again used that same round over bit. Here is our finished front port piece ready for assembly. Now, the more I'm looking at it here, I also want to apply paint to that bottom piece of the enclosure on the inside there, and I want to do that prior to assembly, but also the top of the enclosure on that underside there. Even though you likely would never really see that, I still want to apply paint on the bottom of that there. So I virtually need to do all of my detail work before I can get into the painting process. So now we're going to turn our attention to doing the detail work on these top baffle pieces. In this case, I measure out the center of each of my holes based upon my design here. Now that we have the center of our circle, a trick you can use to lay out your circle is take a piece of cardboard like that of a cereal box, and you can measure out the radius, which is half of the diameter of the circle, and you can make 2 holes. One is going to be for a push pin, and one is going to be for the tip of your pencil, and you can use that piece of cardboard as sort of a compass to draw your perfect circle and then cut it out using a jigsaw. In my case, since I have pre-made templates that match the cutout size and the overall diameter that I need for my cutouts, I'm going to be using these. These purpose-made templates are from one of our other show sponsors, Mobile Solutions. So I'm going to draw my rough cut line here. Now I can once again rough cut that circle and use a flush trim bit on the router to perfectly match the template. Now to make this secondary baffle that has a larger cutout size to flush mount the subwoofer down in, I followed that exact same process. Now you're going to notice that I have a hard corner on the edge here, and again, it's time to turn to the round over bit to soften that up. You can see that using that round over bit gives us a much more finished look on the top side of this subwoofer enclosure. A quick update on the port opening here. I'm thinking a few steps ahead, and I think what I actually want to do is have a transition point between this surface and this surface for applying some different finishing method materials. You guys will see that later in the build series, but I want to point this out because what I've done here is intentionally raised our round over bit just slightly out of the table so that we're going to intentionally cut this corner here into our piece of material and see that edge. This gives me this raised edge here. Again, you'll see what we're going to use that for later in the build series. With all of the detail work now complete on all of these pieces, we can move on to applying the port paint before we do our assembly. Now, nothing crazy here. I'm using flat black paint. I also want to make sure that I use a really short nap roller. That way we get a nice smooth finish. And in spots like this on the port divider, that top face there that will need to bond with this part of the enclosure, I'm going to mask off so that we do not apply any tape on those inside surfaces. That way we have wood-to-wood contact for the wood glue. Doing this painting process obviously takes a bit more time, but we're going to have a much more finished result once we get into the final assembly, which is what we're going to do now that all of this is dry. For the assembly process, the most important things are, first of all, we want to make sure that we get 100% coverage on each of our joints. So we want to make sure that we have plenty of wood glue here and that we use some sort of method to spread it out. It's important to remember that the wood glue is what actually adds all the strength between the joints. And we also want to use clamps to temporarily hold this together and then apply brad nails into the joint to then secure it in place, allowing the glue to dry. Once we've made our joint, I also like to follow up with a bead of wood glue on the inside corner here, which we'll then even out using our finger. This is the bottom of the enclosure, and what I like to do is assemble my two port legs to each other before I add them into the box. So what I've done here is drawn out some lines that correspond with the port geometry along with that center port divider. This allows me to know exactly where I need to shoot the brad nails to make sure that I don't break through into open air. So here's one of my port assemblies. I've just dry fit it in here just to double check everything. I'm going to apply wood glue on these surfaces that mate to the bottom of the enclosure and get it attached. I also applied glue to this joint here, and off camera I just did those brad nails. So now we can flip this up on its face and we can secure from the bottom here. This gives us 1, 2, 3, 4 more joints that we need to smooth out that wood glue, and you can see that it's squeezing out the sides. Another assembly trick here for you guys, when you're looking to get perfect parallel port placement between the different walls, what you can do is just cut yourself a scrap piece of material to the port width. In this case, this is 2 inches from side to side, which I can now position right there, and that's going to make sure that I have that perfect 2-inch gap as I attach this center divider. Pro tip though, once you do get this nailed in place, you definitely want to make sure that you remove that gap piece. Do not allow it to stay in there while the wood glue dries, because if it seeps out of that corner there, it can bond this piece in place. Along with the center divider, I've also got that other port attached. Everything so far is going good. Next up, I want to get our 2-layer baffle assembled. So I'm going to flip this layer over here and again apply a full coat of wood glue. So now we can flip this over and get it in position. Carefully line up each of my edges here. And in this case, use a pin nailer to secure everything in place. Before I add the top of the enclosure, I also want to make sure that I add these corner bracing 45s, again, just using wood glue and brad nails. We are getting very close now. The only pieces I still need to attach are the top baffle and the back of the enclosure. For the top of the enclosure, I want to make sure that I, of course, get glue on all of these surfaces. This is definitely going to be the most complicated layer to attach just because of all the port walls and everything, but I also want to make sure I have glue on this mating surface that this this is going to butt up against as well. So once again, more gluing and more brad nailing. I plan on applying a special coating to this enclosure, so I want to make sure that I go back and fill all of these brad nail holes. This takes just a few more minutes, but it's worth the smooth result. After some sanding now, our enclosure is looking pretty darn clean, but there is one more thing that we can do that is really going to set this enclosure apart. And that is to soften up these hard edges again with our roundover bit. In this case, I'm using the 1/4 inch roundover bit. It's the same as what we used on the port there. It's going to give this a much more finished look. Give you guys a nice close-up here of that rounded corner. Like I said, softening up these corners just gives the enclosure a much more finished look overall. So here we have it, guys, the final assembly of this enclosure complete. We've got our double layer baffle. We've got that angled port to account for the difference between the top depth and the bottom depth, with this being a wedge shape. We have our completely flat black painted port along with roundovers everywhere that they are needed. And you know we've got to give it the boom test. Boom! Sounds good. I am very excited to get this enclosure wrapped up, so coming up, we'll be putting the finishing touches on this build. If you're new here, I'd love to have you as a subscriber so that you can catch future car audio tutorial content. If you're looking for more subwoofer enclosure builds, be sure to check out the playlist here on screen. And again, don't forget that next time you need a battery terminal for your install, to check out the KnuKonceptz Ultimate Battery Terminal. A big thanks to them for being a sponsor of the channel, and also thank you to Jerry and the rest of the Patreon membership team for making these videos possible. Thank you guys for tuning in and watching.